Hi guys. So for you on the Reddit that were asking how I graded this shot, that I use a cheap camera with to make it look like celluloid film. So this is my process, right? Uh, Before I start, I would just like to note that what's important is when you shoot, you use techniques that make it look already as good as possible and as much as possible like how they shot back in the days when they used to use film a lot. So that means harsher light, nice textures, 24 fps, 180 degree shutter rule, all that jazz. Handheld, more on handheld stuff, but not really. These are just guidelines. Yeah, so let's start. In the first node, I use Film Convert to add grain. You can use DaVinci's built-in grain preset or effect. Oh shit. Here, but I prefer this one. I use Super 35 or Super 16. Use whatever for this project. I used Super 35 because it fits the whole vibe a lot better. And here, right here, this batch of nodes are what's called a compound node. It was a compound node, but until I removed it from them. Okay, for here, what you do is I'm gonna delete it just for the sake of it. All right, what you do is add a node by pressing Alt S again, and then Alt L for a layer node. And then you press Alt S again, and this is basically the hilation compound. What you do is you put a color space transform on this one, and on this one. And you choose whatever you shot on. For me, it was Canon log. It wasn't Canon log, but it's the closest to what I shot on. And then on output gamma, you put it on linear, and on here, on the color space transform on the right side, you put input gamma on linear. And then output gamma on what you used here. For me, it was Canon log. And then it doesn't look like anything until you right click this one and then you turn it to add. And then what you do is you go into curves, right? It's gonna be like this. So what you do is turn this down, put a dot on the middle, and increase it just enough that the highlights start popping up a little bit, just a little bit, because you're gonna add contrast more a little bit later. But this is just for the hilation. And the magic begins when, look at this. Look at these highlights. Here, you unchain this, increase the reds for that red glow, increase the green to make it look a little bit orange. And you can increase it even more if you want the effect to become more prominent. To me, I'm gonna leave it like that. Alright. And then that's basically the base. And I mean, you put another node here, make a layer mask, feather it a lot, and then you pull this down for a vignette effect. Really cool. And this is where the grading happens. This is the base, the grain, the hilation, and the vignette. This is the grade. What is important that I learned recently is that you go into the settings here, you click on general options, and you unclick this. I can't explain it because it's a lot, but there's a lot of tutorials out there, but it's important for my technique here. So I increase the contrast on the slider here, down here, adjust the pivot to until like what I like it, and then here, since what the contrast, it kind of crushes the blacks, right? Oh shit, it kind of crushes the blacks like that on here. So what you do here with this one, that's where you fix it. Fix the crushed blacks and the overblown highlights. So I use this. It's very subtle, but you can see the effect on the waveform here. And then you add saturation on this third node. I don't like the saturation here because it's very linear. So what I do is I go to the curves, I press this here, which says Luma versus Sat. And what I notice in film is things are more saturated in the shadows than there are in the highlights. So I make this curve where things are more saturated in the shadows and a little bit desaturated on the highlights. It creates this nice look. especially when it's on like neutral colors and you can see the skin really pop out, and the rest become just like neutral colors. And here is where I do the colors. First of all, I do this one node. I add greens in the highlights, magenta in the gamma, and a very little bit magenta in the shadows, just to push that a little bit more. And then I fix the shadows here by introducing green into the log, just a little bit, so that the shadows become a little bit more neutral than if I were to just remove it and it would look very magenta. And introduce a lot of greens in the highlights, because I noticed that in film there's a lot of greens in the highlights, and everything else is neutral, but there's a lot of greens in the highlights, magenta in the midtones, and quite neutral in the shadows. There's a hint of magenta in the shadows and a hint of green, but mostly it's neutral, but there's a hint there. And then I add a touching up effect, which is the glow. I just add the glow effect and then spread it. That's how it looks. Alright, for our next shot, it's more of a daylight scene, more neutral. And as you can see, I fucked up the focus here, but never mind that. Okay, let's focus on the colors. This is the after. See, okay. I'm gonna turn it off. This is the process. For this one, I added a radial blur, or just around the edges, just for it to, if I was to max it out, the effect would look like this. But just very subtle effect, just a preference type thing. Anyway, okay, we start off with the grain, like before, film grain, film convert, super 35, 100, and then into the halation compounds. There it is, before, after. And this little node here right after this one was just to fix the blown out highlights after the adjustment on the halation. I just turned this down on the log wheels, the highlight. I turned it down until it just sits right on the top of the waveform. And then I introduce another vignette. There you go. So that's the base of the image. And then I introduce some contrast, right? I added a lot of contrast on this one because the shot I felt like really needed it. So, excuse me. When I added the contrast, it really messed up the shadows and the highlights here, especially the darkest parts of the image. So I had to fix it here with the curves. I increased a lot of this LS and LS. Yep. So let's before and after. I should also just to correct that so that it doesn't look all mushy. And then this is what I was saying. If you just use the curves for the saturation instead of the slider, if you add saturation just on the shadows, on the shadow parts, darker parts of the images, it really brings out the skin tone, the blood in the skin, while it keeps everything else quite neutral. See? And then here in the colors, firstly, I added a lot of magenta in the shadows and a little bit of magenta in the lift. A little bit of green on the highlights just to introduce that famous green tint in the highlights of film. Then I corrected the shadows here by using a parallel node by pressing Alt P. Introduce shadows, greens into the shadows to counter the magenta that was introduced earlier. This is before, after, and I introduce a lot more greens in the highlights. And then I introduce the glow effect. So in the last shot, in the previous shot, we used glow, and it looked perfect already. So here, I introduced glow, and you can see the glow here in the window. But what happened is that it blew out. So what you do here is, let's delete this node, right? After you apply the effect, right, it's overblown, it's blown out, I mean. So you press Alt L to create a layer node, so that cancels it out. What it does is it masks whatever you mask on the layer on the layer up below, and it leaves out everything else. So what you do is you pick the color picker and you click on the brightest parts of the images, and then you see that, then you denoise until it looks natural. There you go. So it's not blown out anymore. You have a glowing effect, and we're all happy. And I added another node just to fix this one with the highlight log. Just turn it down until it's just right below the highest part of the waveform. And then I added another node for just another bump of saturation. Turn it down a little bit because I think it's too bright. So yeah, there's the final image. There's the before, there's the after. Play it back a little bit, you know. It looks very cool. That's the tutorial. Thanks for watching, guys.